Chinese President Xi Jinping has just wrapped up a several-day meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That is the first of such in-person meetings since the two met in September 2022 in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. This comes at a time that the ongoing Ukraine crisis is at a critical juncture, with Beijing having presented its peace plan on the issue and also having just brokered a similar deal between regional adversaries in the Middle East, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. It was also reported that Xi could speak with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the wake of this meeting in Moscow. It must also be noted, by the way, on Monday of this week, delegates from 40 African countries convened in Moscow to hold an interparliamentary conference on Russia, Africa, in a multipolar world. And on top of this, it must also be noted that the International Criminal Court recently leveled an indictment against Mr. Putin for alleged war crimes in Ukraine, which, of course, Moscow has denied, and in all likelihood, Putin will never submit to this since Russia is not a party to the Rome Statutes. So, in essence, leaders from across the Global South, China being the flagship of the Global South, and leaders all across Africa are meeting with what the West considers a criminal fugitive. And that is apparently of no consequence to them, because China, for its part, has said the ICC must avoid double standards, clearly hinting at the West's behavior in the past, given the 20-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq that was just inaugurated on March 20th of this year. Russia, China, Africa, and it must also be noted many countries in Asia and Latin America are moving forward with their economic development regardless of the West's proxy war in Ukraine. As the global security situation becomes more turbulent, China has made it clear that its comprehensive strategic partnership with Russia becomes more important in order to level and democratize the international order and create what they call a strategic balance. Here are the major questions as we look at this summit. What is the significance of Russia and China's partnership in the future? What role will the Global South play for Russia's future as it cuts ties with Europe? And why isn't the Global South rushing to take sides in the Ukraine crisis? To discuss this and more, we're joined with British-Bolivian journalist, co-producer and editor of this very show, The Source, and as also a co-founder of Kawsachun News in Bolivia, Ollie Vargas. We're also going to be talking with Ahmed Kaballo, who is a British-Sudanese journalist. He's the CEO and founder of African Stream. And we're going to be joined with Jerry Gray, who is a British-Australian political commentator based in China. We just had the high-level summit between Chinese President Xi Jinping and President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. They just capped off summit. My first question is to you, Ollie. How would you see this trip from its geopolitical significance?
Well, I think it's enormously important for the whole world, and the whole world is following it. And we've seen a number of leaders, at least in Latin America, make statements welcoming this coming together of, two of the most important nations that are helping to build a multipolar world. And in fact, in the next few days, on the 26th, 4 days from the time of recording this, we're going to see the visit of President Lula of Brazil to China. It's going to be a 4-day visit. He's going with 240 business representatives. So this shows, and this goes in all sectors, in agriculture, in manufacturing, mining. So this shows that, at least from Latin America, there's a will to integrate our economies with China and Russia, not only on some level of, so infrastructure investment or loans or these sorts of things, but on a wide range, essentially integrating the whole economy, all sections of the economy into the China and Russia sphere. And I think that trip is going to be hugely important for the whole of the Global South. I think it's going to show what the Global South can do in terms of integrating our economies into China and Russia. And of course, if China especially can help to broker a peace in the conflict in Ukraine, that'll be incredibly important, because the Global South has been massively impacted by the sanctions, Western sanctions against Russia. I mean, just to give you an example, about almost 2/3 of the Ecuadorian banana industry, and that is the largest exporter of banana in Latin America. More than half of that went to Russia, and now all of that got cut off when sanctions began. When sanctions were put in place against Russia, and that led to devastation across the countryside in Ecuador. Entire huge hundreds, thousands of hectares of land essentially going to rot because their largest market had been cut off. So if this can be reestablished, if the normal trade can be reestablished on a global level, with a peace that could be perhaps brokered between China and Russia, with the help of China, as we've seen China playing a role, for example, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. If that can happen, that would be very important. And also the issue, the energy crisis that's gripping the world, the disruption caused by Western sanctions, right across the world, not only for Europe. And although, of course, Europe is suffering of this energy crisis with massively inflated cost of heating one's home, but this is something that has affected the entire globe. The cost of fertilizer has tripled in the time since the beginning of Western sanctions on Russia. That, for example, has triggered massive agricultural problems all across Latin America in countries that don't produce their own fertilizer. So this is a massive, massive problem, this disruption in energy markets caused by NATO sanctions on Russia. So if there can be an exit for this, and people look to China as a possible mediator, a possible route out of this conflict, I think that'll be incredibly important for Latin America and the whole global south.
My next question is for Jerry. So you being in China, how do you see the trip in the context of bilateral relations between China and Russia?
It's a consolidation of something that's very strong right now anyway. Obviously, China and Russia have had problems in the past. They've had border disputes, they've had skirmishes. There's been ideological issues between the forms of communism historically. But fundamentally, this is the cementing of what was already a good foundation 10 years ago when Xi Jinping first became the president of China. His first official visit was to Russia. Now, 10 years later, he's going back there, and he's not just going back there as a new president. He's going back there as a consolidated president. He's in his third term, which the Western media call unprecedented, but in fact is completely wrong because Mao was there for a lot longer than he's been. And so we're talking about somebody who they know each other. Putin and Xi know each other very, very well. They understand each other. They have just signed a deepening and a stronger relationship. And I think it's probably it's going to develop into even more. The Belt and Road and also the Eurasian Economic Union, the Eurasian Economic Union and the Chinese Belt and Road will start to consolidate, and we'll be seeing more trade in that area. And just to cap over what Ollie said, that about the Brazilian thing coming here, that's very important for where I live, which is very close to Macau, a Portuguese-speaking former colony. And Macau has absolutely none of the issues that Hong Kong went through. It's a very, very well-managed, very, very well-run, as is Hong Kong. But it's never had the problems because it's never had the American influence there. The Portuguese-speaking influence of Macau and Zhuhai, which is the area just inland of Macau, those areas are really going to benefit from that particular visit that Ollie just talked about. So it's a very exciting time to be in China right now.
Mm-hmm. My next question for Ahmed. It is reported that China and Russia are pushing ahead with the China-Russia East Route natural gas pipeline. What influence will the visit have on energy cooperation between these two countries, being Russia and China?
I mean, energy cooperation between China and Russia has never halted. And actually, all it does is indicate that while the world is claiming that Russia is isolated because of the conflict with Ukraine, time and time again, we're seeing that's just not the case. We've seen the so-called international community try to bully Africa, which is population of 1.2 billion, China, which has a population of over 1.4 billion, and India, which has a population of over 1.2 billion, into taking sides, into condemning Russia time and time again. They've refused because essentially the African states, India, China, are just like any other state. We work within our own national interest. The idea that we take a moral stance on issue regarding economic trade are just simply not true. And it's not only true when it comes to Africa, India, or China. It's not true for Europe or the United States. We only have to look at the United Kingdom. It had a report investigating whether their warplanes or bombs were being used on civilian infrastructure in Yemen. They found that they were being used, and they continued to sell fighter jets, planes, and also provide support in the control rooms to bomb civilian infrastructure in Yemen. So the global South will not be lectured by the global North on taking moral position when time and time again they've not taken a moral position themselves. And I think the question itself, forgive me for asking, feeds into this narrative that things are going to change because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But when you walk through the streets of China, when you walk through the streets of Bolivia, when you walk through the streets of Nairobi or Johannesburg, the idea that we're going to bite our nose or do something that's going to economically disadvantage our regions is simply not true. We continue to trade, much like much of the world continued to trade after the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, Libya, and so on.
Right. I've got a follow-up question for you, actually. So on Monday, you being a Nairobi-based journalist yourself, what is your reaction to the latest conference that happened on Monday in Moscow, the Russia-Africa ties in the multipolar world? And do you see a growing relationship between Moscow and African nations going forward?
Definitely. I mean, it made one of my first reactions is the mainstream media completely ignored it,
That's right, yeah.
the main parts of the conference, the promise to cancel huge parts of African debt, the move towards more cooperation, the way that that Africa was talked about as a place for opportunity for Russia. Usually it's flipped on its head. Usually we're told that in the US Africa Summit how much of a fantastic opportunity we have doing trade with US. We're rarely ever told that the country hosting the summit has a fantastic opportunity by doing trade with us. And this is just part and parcel of a trajectory that's been happening. Russia is currently the biggest weapons seller in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, to sub-Saharan African armies. And what we're seeing is Africa finally leveraging its economic power on the global stage. We've been the victims of divide and rule. And, it's time that we divide the superpowers amongst themselves as well. So we leverage the superpowers themselves. We take the best deal on the table. The problem in the past with the fall of the Soviet Union is in the unipolar world, the United States was the only big player in town. But with the rise of China, with the emergence of Russia in the last decade or so, we have different opportunities, and Africa is taking that different opportunity. And that's why we're seeing, Anthony Blinken taking trips to the United States, begging and pleading for us to move away from the Chinese sphere of influence. But, as African leaders keep saying, we'll do things that are within our own national interest, and we'll trade with people that serve our own interest. The time of Africa bowing down is over. Our backs have hurt. We don't want to bow no more. Now we deal with nations as equals and based on trade agreements that benefit Africa. If I could use an analogy, it might not be the best analogy, but it's kind of like, someone that was in an abusive relationship before, they might not leave that abusive relationship because they might say, well, the mortgage is so-and-so's name, the car's in so-and-so's name, where am I going to go? What China and Russia have provided is an opportunity to go elsewhere, to leave an abusive relationship. The West's relationship with Africa, it started off with, the enslavement of Africans, then it came colonialism, then came neocolonialism, and then we saw, the latest manifestation of neocolonialism, which is the IMF debt trap. So any opportunity for us to move out of that and develop the infrastructure on the ground, and that's why we've seen, such vast development in Africa over the last 10 years, because there's a new player in town and we're taking advantage of that new player in town.
Mm-hmm. You've just made a point that I want to circle back to in a second, but right now I'm going to go to Ollie. And Ollie, so you're based in Bolivia, you're based in Latin America. You've seen Latin American leaders, as you mentioned before, President Lula of Brazil. For example, Lula was asked by a journalist, and the journalist asked him something like, now that you're president of Brazil, why won't you support democracy in Ukraine? Why won't you send weapons to Ukraine? And he said something like, well, we're not at war with Russia. We're at war with poverty, right? What do you make of this reaction from Brazil, which is the largest economy in Latin America? And why do you think, generally speaking, the global South isn't funneling weapons into the conflict like the West is?
Yeah, it's not just Brazil. More or less the whole of Latin America has taken a formal, at an official level, a position of neutrality in the Ukraine conflict. Though, of course, many countries, whether it be, Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, have voiced this, that they will continue their good relations with Russia despite US sanctions. Just a few days ago, for example, the president of Bolivia, Luis Arce, posted on his Twitter account a picture of him on with a mobile phone to his head, saying, "I've just spoken to my friend Vladimir Putin, and we're going to be deepening our ties, our cooperation on economic matters, science, development, energy, all of these things." And another thing to remember is that there's just the vision and the understanding people have of Russia and Ukraine is completely different in Latin America, and I'm sure across the whole global South, than it is to Europe. And in Europe, for example, I've just anecdotally, I've just had a friend visit. She's Bolivian and lives in the UK. Says, there's Ukrainian flags everywhere. She works in academia, and it is essentially impossible career-wise to question the narrative around what Russia is and what Ukraine is. That will come not only at a social cost in terms of ostracization, but also at a cost for one's own career. That doesn't exist in this country, in this region of the world. So just to give you an example, before the special military operation and before YouTube banned any Russia-affiliated media, RT in Spanish was the number one viewed news source on YouTube in Latin America. Not only in Latin America, in the Spanish language, right? Number one, more than CNN Espanol, more than Telemundo, more than any of the big Miami stations. They had more subscribers and more monthly views than any of these big US-based or Mexico, Latin American-based sort of corporate media outlets. That is an enormously significant thing for the way that Latin Americans view Russia. There's not the demonization, there's not the xenophobia, the Russophobia that exists in Europe, North America. It's just a completely different understanding. And I remember people in the US media were very shocked, for example, when in a Mexican Congress, right as the special military operation was starting, they created a congressional caucus for Mexico-Russia friendship. And people in the United States media were aghast at it. And this is embarrassing. They thought that they were making some sort of faux pas, but no, there is just a completely different understanding about what Russia is and what China is as well. There's a level of admiration for China, and this is with the fact that China doesn't have nearly the reach in terms of soft power, cultural power that the United States does in these regions. People in Latin America, they watch American films dubbed or with subtitles, they listen to American music, but there is a level of admiration for China's path to development. And that's the way China has created a leadership for itself, is not by forcing countries to adopt this model through sanctions or international tribunals. Like, for example, if a country nationalizes a certain industry and US corporations take them to a tribunal, China doesn't have that approach. China is essentially led by example. And now you have countries, even countries with right-wing governments in Latin America. I remember at the start of the conflict, for example, Panama has a conservative, pro US government, but the Panama Canal, the official authorities around the Panama Canal, which is one of the most important trade routes in the entire world, they stated very clearly that we will not be applying sanctions to Russia. Whatever sanctions the United States are applying, that would not be applied by Panama. And Russia has had, throughout this entire period, access to the Panama Canal, which, as I said, one of the most important trade routes in the whole world. Another example, Ecuador. Ecuador is one of the most right-wing governments in South America. It's had numerous, spats with some of the more progressive governments within Latin America. But when it comes down to it, what was one of the first acts, one of the first foreign visits of their president, Guillermo Lasso, was to China. He was received in Beijing by Xi Jinping, where they agreed on trade deals, infrastructure investment, huge vaccine donations. Ecuador essentially was one of the worst hit during the pandemic. They had no help from the United States, even though they, prostrated themselves before the United States. But they did receive that medical aid from China at the height of the pandemic. When, I used to live in Ecuador, and the people I know
did as well. Yeah.
Yeah, you did as well, Bradley. And for example, in the city of Guayaquil, people were dying on the streets. There were dead bodies on the streets. That was the severity of it. And the only country that came to their aid, even though they have a right-wing government that was, on a political level allied with the United States, China came in with medical aid. And even though that presidential candidate, during the campaign, he talked about how the former government had sold the country to China and all this and that. But when it came down to it, they know what's a good deal and what's not a good deal. That's another country, Uruguay, one of the only conservative governments in South America that's still left. They're the ones most aggressively pushing for a trade deal with China at Mercosur. Mercosur is the South American trade bloc. They are the strongest voice for a South America-wide trade deal with China at the moment. And they are a conservative government that has very good relations with the United States, very close, one of the closest to the United States. But even their own allies now are looking for a development model which is more advantageous. The issue of lithium is going to be key for the future. We all know this in terms of electric cars, batteries, etc. It's part of the transition to more green energy going forward, moving away from fossil fuels. And the deal that Bolivia has one of the largest reserves in the world with China, is extremely advantageous, something that would never happen with a US-based company. So the deal essentially with a Chinese company just signed a couple of months ago is essentially that the Bolivian state company, ELB, will have overall control of the process of extraction and industrialization within the country. So creating value-added products within the country. They will have overall control, and the Chinese company accepted a minority stake in that, and they will provide the investment. They will provide almost all of the investment necessary because, of course, it's very expensive to do these things. Bolivia doesn't have the resources to develop, the lithium industry. The Chinese company is going to come in, provide more than 20 different processing plants in the south of Bolivia, and while still accepting a minority stake in in the profits. That's something that never happened with when US corporations owned natural gas and owned mining. Look at countries like Peru, where Canadian mining companies essentially have company towns in Andean areas of Peru. Is a very, very different model, and I think everyone, regardless of ideology, regardless of the official ideology of the government, of the party in power, is analyzing this with a cold head and looking towards that multipolar world.
You raised a really good point there about the fact that China is engaging in this kind of non-political model of economic cooperation, which actually a lot of people don't know is actually what led to the creation of the European Union itself. It started with coal and steel agreements that eventually led to the complete integration of of Europe as the European Union. So, I think actually people in South America and Latin America are talking about creating some kind of similar mechanism. For our audience, I do have to also comment on what you said about the xenophobia that you don't see in South America, but you do see in the West, and particularly in former Eastern Bloc countries. Now, where I live in the Czech Republic, it is possible, and I know Russian speakers. I speak Russian myself, so I have a lot of Russian friends, and I have actually heard stories of Russian-speaking people getting rejected from university, for example, just for the fact that they have a Russian passport. And you see, I actually wrote about this in a column for Global Times, that essentially the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a mechanism for people to just try to settle historical scores. For example, a lot of Czechs have resentment against Russia for the 1968 Prague Spring that was precipitated by the invasion of the Warsaw Pact governments of Czechoslovakia at that point to depose the reformist government. Of course, this was criticized heavily by China. It was part and parcel with the Sino-Soviet split. Nonetheless, Czech people have a strong resentment against Russians, and this conflict is just a mechanism for them to justify their hatred against Russians. I've heard people like Dominik Hasek, who's a very famous NHL player, and he's also he's originally from Czechoslovakia. And he said that the NHL should just straight up ban all Russian players, just not allow them to play. We're seeing this idea of universal guilt, which is actually written into the laws of most former Eastern Bloc countries. They have literally by the law, banned every functionary who was associated with for example, the Czech FSB, the secret police, who were associated with the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. Completely banned them from civil society. We had doctors and bureaucrats, functionaries within the government just lose their jobs overnight. And I have to say that the first experience I ever had living out of the United States. Now, in the United States, we don't have companies like Huawei, Xiaomi. We don't have Chinese motorcycles, for example. But as you mentioned, Ollie, in Ecuador, where both you and I used to live, that was the first time I ever saw a Chinese motorcycle, which was actually quite cheap. I found out it was like at the time $600 just for a motorcycle, and it was quite useful for a lot of working class people to obtain these. My friend at the time, Elliot, who was working with us, he showed me a Xiaomi phone, which had the same essential quality as an iPhone, and it was like $50, and I was mind blown. Yeah, it was a really high quality phone, and it was cheap, and it enabled people in South America to have access to technology. Yeah, see, Jerry he's shown us his Xiaomi, I believe. Another thing I want to say is that living in Ecuador, I also, I engaged in the nightlife there. I went to some clubs, and I heard for the first time songs from Russia that were censored during the Cold War. We're talking about hit 80 songs that were hits all over the world that I had never even heard as a U.S. citizen my entire life growing up, and then I get to enjoy them at a club in Ecuador. It's pretty hilarious, but it speaks to the point that people in South America, Latin America in general, don't have the same xenophobia or censorial attitude against Russians. So I just wanted to throw that out there for our audience about my own personal experience seeing this, and my own lived experience. Now, I want to get back to you, Jerry.
Can I just quickly add to that point?
Yeah, go ahead.
Before I moved to Nairobi, it was just when the war started. And the University of West London did a U-turn on a application for a master's student that was studying tourism and hospitality. And in the letter they said, in light of the recent conflict in Ukraine. So this is this collective punishment is happening all over the place. We've obviously saw it with in terms of sports. And we've even seen it with students that have got absolutely nothing to do with the decision or the conflict in Ukraine, have played no role in it whatsoever. So it's a problem that's happening all over the place, apart from, as Ollie mentioned, in the global south.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're seeing it everywhere. You're seeing this intense Russophobia, people canceling. For example, my former band played at this place called a rock opera in Prague, and this rock opera, they do renditions of all kinds of famous music all over the world, and they had to cancel their rendition of Swan Lake because Czech people just didn't show up. They're just like, hey, this is Russian associated. We don't want to see it. Get it out of our country. It is, to me, a bit ridiculous to tie all of this together. And if you take it to this level where it's applied universally, can you imagine, the total cancellation of U.S. cultural exports if the U.S. were held to account for the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, all of its military adventurism around the world, the proxy conflicts? I mean, it would be enormous. We would cancel all American social media. We probably wouldn't be able to talk right now via the service we're using at the moment. So it is, this double standards are incredible. And, I've written quite extensively about this. And that leads me to my next point about something that I have written. So, Jerry, I shared with you the day before this interview my piece that was published around this time last year. And I argued why China would be a good mediator in the Ukraine conflict. And I noted the extensive amounts of cooperation that China has with Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars in tangible assets. I mean, China owns hundreds of thousands of hectares of Ukrainian land for its farmland. It helped retrofit the Yuzhny port in Odessa. It built another port in Mykolaiv. China is deeply invested in Ukraine. It sees it as a strategic partner. To quote Zelensky himself, President Zelensky, Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, he said that Ukraine is a gateway between the East and the West because Ukraine and China have a free trade agreement. And to note, the EU does not have a trade agreement with China, so a lot of goods that go to the EU go through China, go through Ukraine from China, and So my point is this: China has a strategic partnership with both Ukraine and Russia. It owns extraordinary amounts of tangible assets between both countries. So China stands to benefit from a predictable and stable relationship with both countries and the whole of the Eastern European region in general, which I argued last year made it the perfect peace broker. And we kind of rapped about this tweet. I had a thread on Twitter and you shared it very kindly. Thank you for that. What do you make of my argument that I put together last year, just weeks after the conflict broke out?
It's an absolutely valid, it remains a valid argument. The issue is not whether or not China can benefit from this, but China has a lot to lose, an awful lot to lose. And I think so does Ukraine, of course, but China has a lot to lose economically from losing. One of the biggest things, I think, was corn coming into China. China uses a lot of corn.
China has 90% of its imports from Ukraine.
It produces a lot of its own corn, but of what it imports, I think corn and wheat, and there was something else
as well.
Barley, yeah. Those three things were coming in, and these are massive percentages of what they do import. They import a lot, or used to import a lot of barley from Australia, but there was a World Trade Organization dispute over that, and they stopped it. And then the Australians claimed that China had sanctioned them, which was absolutely untrue. And it was just a simple case of a disagreement, which got to the point of Australia saying, well, we're not going to buy that anymore. And that was the only thing. So they were bringing in corn, barley, wheat, agricultural products. And there's a huge amount of work going on between those two countries in the background. Now, what will happen if my understanding of it is that most of the material and the goods and the money that's coming from the United States into Ukraine is not gifts, it's not donations. It's
That's
loans.
Right. It's a lend-lease program, yeah.
Lend-lease type of thing. Now, I know for a fact that being British and being my age, I was born in the 50s, and I lived through fairly austere times because Britain was still paying back Lend-lease right the way through until this century. So it took 60 years to pay off the Lend-lease that Britain had with America. I think the difference between Britain was that it was a powerhouse economically and could afford to do that, even though it had to tighten its belt for the next 60 years. Ukraine has no chance of doing that. So these assets that you talked about that China holds in Ukraine. And I don't think they own. I think it's like Ollie says, they take a share, and that share is usually a non-controlling share, so that
That's
they can
right.
benefit both parties. They do the same thing in pretty much every other country that they're in, where they invest into a business. They don't buy the business because they don't want to. They don't want to run businesses in foreign countries. They want the foreign country to run the business, but they want to have the win-win situation of being able to take the resources and actually benefit the whole of society. This is something that Deborah Broadingham touched on in her book about the myth of the debt trap. China does not trap countries into debt. It shares the resources, it shares the benefits, and it's win-win for both countries. That's the benefit of doing business with China. But of course, every single propaganda item that we see says the opposite. Beware of dealing with China, they will trap you. Whereas for the last 400 years, as Ahmed would be able to verify, for the last 400 years, it's been the other lot that have been entrapping people, enslaving people, entrapping people, colonizing, imperializing. And it's been a terrible situation. So China does have a lot to lose, but it has a lot to gain by brokering the peace. If the sooner that can happen, forgetting about the economics of it, how many people are dying on a daily basis, and that needs to stop. And if anybody in their right mind thinks that that's wrong, there must be something wrong with that mind. And that's, I'm seeing this from Blinken and Kirby, and pretty much every spokesperson in America is saying, we can't have a peace. We can't have a ceasefire. It's not the right time. Well,
it seems like they're waiting for Ukraine's spring offensive and then to see the results of this and to decide what's going to happen
maybe
next.
That's what it is. But what about the guys in the trenches?
Right.
They need to come out of there.
Now, so I've sent a pitch to my local newspaper in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was born. It has a couple million in circulation in print and in digital media. And this piece is going to debunk this myth that China is actually going to give weapons to Russia to prolong the conflict in Ukraine. And the primary argument that I want to make in this piece, which I hope gets accepted so the American people can read this and see the truth about this, is that it would be ridiculous for China to sell weapons to Russia because, as I've already mentioned, China owns doesn't own, but has a stake in hundreds of billions of dollars in tangible assets. The second and third largest wind power operations in Europe are in Ukraine, or before the war, were in the process of being built. Like I said, China owns hundreds of thousands of hectares of land in Ukraine. Chinese companies got a public tender to build another metro line in Kiev. Mm-hmm. So does it make sense for China to sell weapons to Russia to destroy the assets that its own companies have a stake in? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the flat out makes no sense. And, Ollie made a very good point before, is that in terms of China's peace proposal, it was met with universal, I would say, underwhelmment from Western observers. They're like, it's a bunch of platitudes and BS. But the same was said about China's Middle East peace plan that it introduced while it was it signed a 20-year cooperation with Iran and then signed a free trade agreement with over 20 initiatives and integrating Saudi Arabia into the Belt and Road Initiative. And that precipitated the peace agreement between these two regional and sectarian adversaries in the Middle East, and essentially is putting the Syrian war and the war in Yemen to bed overnight. And people reacted the same way to China's Ukraine peace proposal. But my argument is that China has a strategic relationship with both countries. So to say that China wants to take part in the war, or that it wants to sell weapons to Russia to destroy assets that its own companies have a stake in, just doesn't pass the basic sniff test, I think, and direction to that.
It's not even in China's DNA. China is not an encroaching country. It's not it's developing militarily as a defensive force because it's been through a very, very difficult history. So it has developed militarily. It's developed, but that is a defensive force, not offensive. It's not in China's DNA. Chinese people are not fighters. They're traders. I mean, if you take a look at what happened historically over the last 1,000 years, 400 years, 500 years, Zhang He went around the world with his boats, and China has never colonized anybody. I mean, admittedly, there are some countries that have very high populations of Chinese people, but they didn't colonize those countries. They haven't gone to Singapore or Malaysia to colonize them. They've gone there to trade with them and settled there, and now they live there. They're basically, I don't think you can find a city in the world that doesn't have Chinese people. That's what they do. They're not colonizing. They're not taking over. They're not trying to change anybody else's ideology. They are simply trying to do business, and that is historically what they've always done. A friend of mine, Mario Cavallo, put a tweet out today, which it was very cleverly done. He said, "I'm going to give you a list of all the countries that China has invaded in the last 4 decades," and then went quiet for several minutes and said, "That's it. That's the list." There are none. They haven't done it. It's not in their history. It's not in their DNA. And they've certainly, if you read what China says they're going to do, and then watch what China does, you'll find that those two things usually match. They've never said they're going to invade anywhere, let alone Taiwan. They're never going to invade Taiwan. It's their own country anyway. So they've never said this. And when you listen to what China says it wants to do, and then watch what it does, you'll find they match.
It's a very good point. If I could just add to that point.
Okay. I also want to just real quick plug our first episode of this show, because we went really deep into that topic with Washington, D.C. talk show host Garland Nixon. We talked a lot about Ukraine. So if, for our viewers, if you want to get more information on that, go back to our first episode of this show. And yeah, Ahmed, go ahead and comment on what Jerry just said.
Yeah, just to add to what Jerry said, it's actually quite interesting. The language that the West uses to warn against China, it's essentially using a reflection of what the West has done in Africa, for example, and say, the Chinese are going to do this to you next. Forgetting the fact that the West is currently doing this. You know, we've had so many leaders assassinated, so many coups d'etats, so many militia forces supported by,
I think, by the way, one point that a lot of people don't know is the fact that, for example, France is still being paid reparations for colonizing Africa, and a significant amount of the EU's money actually is basically just neo-colonial money from Africa. Significant amounts. Yes. Absolutely tremendous amount of this money. I don't know the exact figure, but I know it is quite significant. Maybe you know this.
There's a quote from, I think it was former French President Hollande, that says, without Africa, France would be reduced to a third world country. So that just puts it into perspective. And we have, the most... I
think that this is really in the range of hundreds of billions of euros per year given from African nations as reparations for... What, colonizing them? They say building infrastructure during their colonization period, but I mean, how can you? It's ridiculous to charge people money for raping and pillaging your country.
Yeah, and in France, the CFA franc is controlled in Paris. Paris allots African nations, their own currency to then spend how they see fit. We have French company Arriva, which has a deal in Niger, where Niger gets 5% of the profits. 5%. There's no way two nations that are equals or even respect each other would ever agree with a relationship where one entity gets 95% and the other entity gets 5%. So it really does describe the neo-colonial relationship. And that's why we're seeing, increasingly the move against France's influence in the region. Mali and Burkina Faso have recently kicked out the French troops after their failed operation to fight so-called jihadism in the region.
Yeah, the Czech Republic is also, we have troops, or we had, I don't know if they're still there, but the Czech Republic also was joining France in this operation. We had troops there in the Sahel region.
Yeah, but I just find it fascinating, the language that they use. So they use language about debt. They say, oh, China's going to trap you into debt, when that's precisely what the IMF does. IMF headquarters in the United States. IMF is US backed. They say, China is supporting instability in the region, but we only have to look at, the problems in the Sahel at the moment are precisely because of, 12 years ago, the NATO bombardment and removal of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and the proliferation of weapons throughout the region, that we're still living with the consequences of today. We're seeing the rise of ISIL in places like Mali. We've seen Boko Haram. All these groups, had no real presence in the region before that huge destabilization process. Yet they can say with a straight face, beware of the Chinese because they're destabilizing the region. Beware of the Chinese because all they're trying to do is trap African countries into debt. So I think,
and that's something, by the way, I wanted to ask you about is this myth of the Chinese debt trap. And I mean, I've seen polls that most African people do not believe this. What are you seeing on the streets in Nairobi, where you're based at?
Well, we can do maths in Africa. We're mathematicians as well as, just Africans. We know that three times of the debt owed is not to the Chinese, but it's actually owed to Western countries and Western corporations. So if there's any debt trap and the interest rates on Chinese debt are incomparable to the interest of the debt owed to the IMF. And furthermore, as Jerry mentioned previously, with the Chinese loans, there's no stipulations. Now, we've just had protests in Nairobi. I had to ask the staff to work from home because of protests against the cost of living crisis. Now, what's actually behind the cost of living crisis is the newly elected President Ruto was advised, we can use the term advised loosely, by the IMF that they need to strip subsidies on fuel, strip subsidies on maize, which is the key ingredient for the national dish of ugali. And this has caused people to really struggle. People can't afford to get to work. Uber's drivers can't afford to drive around. It's caused huge problems. And a lot of the problems are because the IMF is dictating to the newly elected president on how he needs to allocate his budget. And there's not one single example of the Chinese doing this in a single African country where they say, we're lending you this money, but the stipulations are you must reduce public spending, you must strip away subsidies, you must pay teachers less.
These structural readjustments, yeah.
Exactly. So, what we are seeing is the infrastructure. We're seeing roads, we're seeing bridges. In Africa, we're sick and tired of people talking. Show us through infrastructure. If you want to show us, your benevolence, build something. And that's what the Chinese have been doing. And that's why the reputation of the Chinese in places like Latin America, in places like the Caribbean, in places like Africa, is far higher than it is in the global north.
I read a study.
In the South Pacific.
I would like to say that I read a study about the European Union and the U.S. and how they're trying to launch a counter propaganda narrative in Serbia because they're upset with the fact that Serbians don't have China. They don't have the EU and the U.S. and as high of a regard as China. And they said that in this study that I'm talking about, they concluded that, in fact, it's the EU and the US that give more money to Serbia than China does. However, if you look in their own study, if you look at the details of what they're spending the money on, it's quite interesting. China is spending money on telecommunications, healthcare, medicine. They're spending money on infrastructure. If you're familiar with Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, you will know that for years there was only one bridge that went across the Danube. And the Chinese built the second bridge, which significantly reduced the time of travel in this city, the capital of the country. And it is called the Chinese Bridge. People just call it that. And it's a very visible symbol of China's influence in Serbia. And if you look at the money, now if you look at like USAID's budget, what they're doing in Serbia, they're spending all their money on what they call civil society initiatives, meaning they're training journalists to, engage in free speech, but this usually just turns out to be interference against the ruling government of Serbia and President Aleksandar Vučić. They're training judges on how to have Western-minded jurisprudence, which means just accusing their leaders of corruption and things like this. So it's all civil society initiatives, which are I would describe them as just political interference in the internal affairs of a country, whereas China is spending money on very visible and very upfront aid to these countries. And there was one sign that was all around Belgrade during the height of the COVID pandemic when Serbia was quite hard hit, and it said "Moj brat Xi," meaning my brother Xi. All right, because China sent doctors and they sent medical equipment to help Serbia. And just the week before this, there was a Balkan summit in Prague where they again promised them to Serbia and all the other Western Balkan countries, yeah, we're going to get you in the European Union. You just got to continue to buy European goods. Don't buy Chinese goods. But then when the COVID pandemic happened, the European Union stopped selling medical supplies to Serbia. And Alexander Vucic at that time said, so now, what, Serbian money is no good to you? Okay, well, we're just going to go with China. We're just going to have the Chinese send their supplies here, and we'll buy from them. And that is exactly why the relationship between Serbia and China is so strong, because there is tangible, in your face, things that you can see, things that you can use, not this quote-unquote civil society support to help you with these illustrious, phantasmal ideas of freedom of speech or anti-corruption or whatever. I think maybe we can end on this. Ollie, what do you think about, what I was just talking about in the West, how, their idea of support versus China's idea of support? One example I think maybe you can comment on is the example of Central America. And right now, Honduras is in a spat with the United States because they want to reestablish ties with China. The U.S. is condemning this. They're almost invoking the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is the United States' hemisphere, and countries in this Western Hemisphere have to do what the United States says. Now, the U.S., Kamala Harris visited Guatemala. Not only did she tell people in Central America, do not come to our country, almost sounding like Donald Trump himself, but they put forward their own idea of investment. And the details of this seemed to be, again, quite neo-colonialist in their intent. However, for example, Nicaragua is in the middle of negotiating a free trade agreement with China. And our friend Benjamin Norton, who was just on the last episode of this show, told me how much this would benefit not only Nicaragua, but Central America to have these trade relations. So you in Latin America, how do you see the difference in Chinese trade cooperation versus the United States?
Yeah, of course, Central America has a kind of a very particular history as, some of the only countries in the world that used to recognize Taiwan as a state, as an independent country. And now that's changed. Now we have Nicaragua. Nicaragua was the first last year to break relations with Taiwan, withdraw recognition, and restore full diplomatic, economic, political ties with China. And, now, even the Chinese ambassador in Nicaragua has taken on an almost sort of semi-celebrity status there. And now Honduras has followed suit. And of course, Honduras, the context for that is that Honduras had lived under what I would classify as, a hybrid, a semi-dictatorship ever since 2009, when there was a US-backed coup, which most people within Honduras point to Hillary Clinton as being the brainchild of, against the left-wing government of Manuel Zelaya. And then now, in last year, Xiomara Castro took power. She's actually his wife. And so now there's an understanding of what the US represents there. There's an understanding of what the US propped up for all those years. The descent as well of Honduras into becoming one of the countries with the highest rates of homicide in the world. Honduras and El Salvador higher than anywhere with a war zone. And that was all something that happened with governments that swore their loyalty to the United States. And now there is an understanding that there has to be another route. And even, country, and I'm not talking, as I said when I first spoke, This is not simply a left-right issue. For example, we see in El Salvador where we have a more conservative government, a right-wing government, but where
the Bitcoin
they
guy.
have attempted to take their certain decisions, whether one agrees with them or not. You had the IMF coming in. You've had the United States, particularly the Biden administration, attacking them for certain decisions they make. And so when we take all of this, they say, why do we want to work with a power that conditions, as Ahmed said, how many deals, how many trade deals, how much investment from the United States, some of it positive, has come with so many strings attached. And when you have another power that doesn't come with those strings, and I'm not just talking about China, I'm talking about Russia as well. Here, not too far from where I am right now, there is Bolivia's first ever cancer treatment center using nuclear medicine technology that was done with Russian investment. Before that, Bolivia never had any way to have advanced cancer treatment. Even the current president himself, Luis Arce, he was the economy minister under the former government of Evo Morales. And
can I just ask a question real quick, Ollie? Now, so I know that, for example, China has its first ever nuclear reactor deal with Argentina, but as I understand, Bolivia has an experimental nuclear reactor that was done with Russian cooperation. Is that correct?
That's right, in El Alto,
Yeah.
and now a second one is about to be opened in Santa Cruz, which is the largest city in the country, and they're going to be rolling this out in all regions of the country. And this is hugely important because before there was no way. People either had to leave the country to seek treatment, which it was people with money, and those who couldn't afford to do so would have to just would enter essentially straight into palliative care, even though many cancers are curable.
That's awful, man.
Yeah, and I'll say even the president himself, Luis Arce, when he was the economy minister, so this is someone who has a certain level of income. He's a government minister, senior minister, throughout for an entire year. And now he say, when he inaugurated this, he said, now if I was to have my diagnosis now, I would be able to have my treatment within the country. And that was thanks to Russian investment. And this was demonized by the pro-US opposition within the country, saying, oh, we're selling ourselves to Russia, all these things. The United States released, the State Department and the embassy released statements against this. Fear-mongering, saying that because this is used nuclear technology, this could blow up and this could, wipe out our city, all these sorts of things. So there was a huge effort to smear this, these sorts of projects. But yeah, that's just an example of win-win cooperation between not only China and also Russia and Latin America.